The silk of her dress was the color of a twilight bruise, a deep and vibrant purple embroidered with silver cranes that seemed to shimmer and fly in the oppressive Nevada heat. It was the finest thing Mai had ever owned, a testament to a promise made across an ocean. But here, on the splintered boardwalk of Redemption Gulch in the summer of 1882, it felt like a costume, marking her as alien, as other. The dust, a fine red powder, settled on the exquisite fabric, dulling its sheen. It settled in her throat, making it hard to breathe. Her intended, Alastair Finch, stood before her, his face flurried with anger and the midday whiskey he'd been drinking since her stagecoach arrived. He was a man whose wealth was announced by the shine on his boots and the gold watch chain stretched across his considerable middle. He had paid a great deal for her, a fact he seemed keen to impress upon the gathering crowd of miners, merchants, and drifters. "Look at it," Alastair boomed, his voice carrying across the dusty street. He gestured not to her, but to the dress. "I send for a wife, a respectable American wife, and what arrives? This spectacle. This is a mining town, not an opera house in Shanghai." Mai stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her. She had been taught that stillness was a woman's shield. Her English was careful, learned from tutors in her father's prosperous San Francisco trading house, but she kept it locked behind her teeth. She had been instructed to be demure, quiet, agreeable. Her father's letters had been clear: Alastair Finch was their family's salvation. His investment would save them from the ruin his own predatory ventures had caused. This marriage was not a union of hearts, it was the settling of a debt written in ink and desperation. And silent, Alastair sneered, stepping closer. The crowd murmured, some with pity, most with morbid curiosity. "I paid for a companion, not a porcelain doll. Can you even speak the king's English, or are you to nod and bow your way through our life together?" He reached out and tugged roughly at the high, stiff collar of her cheongsam. "This thing must come off. My wife will wear gingham and calico, like a decent woman." The tug was a violation. It broke through her practiced stillness. Mai flinched, a small, sharp movement. Her gaze, which had been fixed on a point just past his shoulder, met his. In her eyes, for a flicker of a second, was not fear, but a cold, hard anger. It was a look Alastair had never seen on the face of a woman he believed he owned. It enraged him further. He saw it as defiance, an intolerable affront from his newest, most expensive acquisition. He raised his hand, not to strike, but to humiliate. He meant to tear the fabric at her throat, to show this silent, stubborn woman and the whole town who was master. The gasp from the crowd was a collective intake of breath, a tightening of the social knot. They were about to witness something ugly, and they would watch, because that is what crowds do. The hand never landed. "That's not how you treat a lady." The voice was low and even, cutting through Alastair's tirade without raising its volume. It held the flat, dry quality of the desert itself. It came from a man leaning against a support pillar of the assayer's office, a man who seemed to have materialized from the heat haze. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a dust-colored coat. Nothing about him announced wealth or importance. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. The only thing of note was the practiced way he stood, a kind of relaxed readiness that was more unnerving than any open threat. His right hand rested on his thigh, inches from the worn walnut grip of a holstered pistol. Alastair Finch turned, his face contorting with fury at the interruption. "Who in the blazes are you? This is a private matter. This woman is my betrothed." The stranger pushed himself off the pillar with a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't look at Alastair. His eyes, a startlingly clear grey, were on Mai. He took in the purple dress, the rigid posture, the flicker of defiance in her dark eyes that only he seemed to have truly seen. "Private matters sometimes get a public audience," the man said, his voice still quiet. "And the audience doesn't always like the show." He took a step forward, and the crowd instinctively parted for him. "The lady looks tired from her travels. Perhaps you could see her to her rooms at the hotel, instead of holding court in the street." "The lady will do as I command," Alastair spat, turning his back on the stranger to reassert his dominance over Mai. It was a critical mistake. He had dismissed the threat. The stranger's hand moved, not toward his gun, but to Alistair's shoulder. His grip was surprisingly strong. He spun the larger man around to face him. "My name is Garrett Shaw," he said, his voice losing its lazy drawl and gaining a steel edge. "And I believe I made a suggestion." Alistair's face went from red to a mottled purple. He was a man who bought and sold everything, including people. He was not accustomed to being contradicted, let alone manhandled. "You will take your hand off me, drifter, or I'll have the marshal run you out of town on a rail." "The marshal is playing poker over at the saloon," Garrett replied calmly. "He's losing. I doubt he'll want to be disturbed." He tightened his grip just enough to make Alistair wince. "Now, about the hotel." The standoff held the street captive. It was no longer about a frightened bride, it was a direct challenge to the town's most powerful man. Alistair Finch, sputtering and impotent, finally seemed to realize he had misjudged the situation. He couldn't win a physical confrontation, and the stranger's unnerving calm was robbing him of his bluster. His public humiliation of Mai had backfired, turning into his own. He violently shrugged off Garrett's hand. "Fine," he hissed, his voice tight with venom. He glared at Mai. "You. Hotel. Room 7. Don't leave it." He then turned his glare on Garrett. "This isn't over. You've made an enemy today, Shaw. A powerful 1-inch. With that, Alistair Finch stormed off toward the saloon, presumably to find the marshal, leaving Mai standing alone in the sudden, ringing silence. The crowd began to dissipate, muttering amongst themselves. The free entertainment concluded. Mai was left with the stranger, Garrett Shaw. He had not moved. He simply stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable under the brim of his hat. She should have been grateful, but gratitude was a luxury. He had saved her from a moment of humiliation, but he had also marked her. By associating with him, she was now tied to Alistair's enemy. She had traded one form of danger for another. She finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and gave a small, formal bow of her head, a gesture of thanks that felt inadequate and foreign. "Thank you," she said, and her voice, when it came, was clear and unaccented. It was not the voice of a timid, frightened girl. It was the voice of a woman who had been holding her breath and had finally let it out. Garrett Shaw's eyebrows raised just a fraction. It was the first sign of surprise he had shown. He had expected broken English, perhaps just a nod. He hadn't expected the perfect, crisp resonance of a well-educated woman. He had stepped in to protect a victim. He was beginning to suspect he had done something else entirely. What he found in the street that day was not what he had imagined, and the real trouble in Redemption Gulch had only just begun. Garrett gestured toward the hotel at the end of the street. "Room 7, I believe," he said. He picked up the small, sturdy traveling case that had been dropped by her feet during the confrontation. It was heavier than it looked. "Allow me." Mai hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Walking beside him, she was acutely aware of the space between them, and of the few remaining eyes that watched them from windows and doorways. Alistair Finch was not a man to forgive a public slight. His influence ran deep in this town, woven from money, loans, and intimidation. Garrett Shaw had cut one of those threads in the middle of the street, and the whole web was now trembling. The hotel lobby was dim and smelled of stale cigar smoke and old wood. The clerk, a thin man with a nervous twitch, avoided looking at them as Garrett requested the key to room 7. He slid it across the counter as if it were hot to the touch. The room was small and stuffy, containing a narrow bed, a washstand with a ceramic basin, and a single window overlooking a dusty alley. Garrett placed her case on the floor. The silence in the room was thick and uncomfortable. "Mr. Finch, he is an important man here," Mai said, breaking the quiet. She stood by the window, her back to him, the silver cranes on her dress seeming to droop in the dim light. "He's a bully with a long reach," Garrett corrected her. "There's a difference." "For a woman in my position, it is a difference without a distinction," she replied, turning to face him. Her composure was absolute, a stark contrast to the trembling woman Alistair had tried to provoke. "You have put yourself in danger for my sake." Why? Garrett leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He considered the question, his grey eyes studying her with an unnerving intensity. Let's just say I don't like bullies. It was a simple answer, yet it felt incomplete. Your English is very good. My father believed a daughter should be as well educated as a son, she said. It is an unconventional view. Your father agreed to this marriage? Garrett asked, his tone neutral. A shadow passed over Mai's face. My father is a good man facing difficult circumstances. Mr. Finch presented himself as a solution. A business partner. And you were part of the deal, Garrett stated. It wasn't a question. I was the seal on the contract, she confirmed, her voice devoid of self-pity. A guarantee of good faith. There was that stillness about her again, that sense of a deep, controlled current running beneath a placid surface. Garrett had seen men with that kind of control on battlefields and at poker tables where a man's life was in the pot. He had rarely seen it in a woman, and never in one so young, dressed in a silk gown and sent to the frontier to be a rich man's wife. Finch won't let this go, he said. He was shamed. Men like him can abide losing money or land, but never face. He'll send someone for you. Or for me. I know, Mai said. He will not want me speaking to you. He will want to isolate me, to ensure I remember my place. Garrett pushed off the door frame. Then you have a choice to make. You can lock this door and wait for him to return, and hope his temper has improved. Or you can decide that the contract isn't worth the price. Mai walked over to her traveling case and unfastened the leather straps. She opened the lid. Inside, beneath a layer of neatly folded, practical clothing, was a false bottom. She lifted it, revealing not jewels or money, but a slim leather-bound ledger and a sheaf of papers tied with a ribbon. She picked up the ledger. This is the price, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. This contract was not made in good faith. Alastair Finch ruined my father's shipping business in San Francisco through predatory contracts and deliberate sabotage of his cargo. He created the debt he then offered to forgive in exchange for my hand and my father's silence. She held out the ledger. This is a copy of his private accounts, kept by a clerk who owed my family a kindness. It details the scheme. I did not come here merely to be a wife, Mr. Shaw. I came to find the original documents, which the clerk said Finch keeps in his office safe, here in Redemption Gulch. This ledger is the key, but I need the originals as proof to take to the territorial authorities. Garrett stared at the book in her hand, then back at her face. The entire situation reconfigured itself in his mind. This wasn't a rescue. He hadn't stumbled upon a damsel in distress. He had walked into the middle of a war, and this quiet, composed woman was a soldier. You came here alone, planning to rob the most powerful man in town, he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. I came here to reclaim my family's honor, she corrected him gently. The method was yet to be determined. He let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a laugh. You have more sand than any 10 men in this town. He looked from the ledger back to her. He understood now. The stillness, the perfect English, the cold fire in her eyes. It was all part of a carefully constructed plan. A desperate, dangerous plan. He did not yet know that his own past was about to collide with her future. He was no mere drifter. The tarnished U.S. Marshal's badge in his coat pocket was proof of that. He had come to Redemption Gulch on the trail of a land baron from Wyoming who was wanted for fraud on a federal level, a man who had cheated dozens of homesteaders out of their claims. A man who, according to his sources, was now operating under the name Alastair Finch. Before he could speak, a heavy pounding rattled the door. It wasn't a knock, it was a demand. Open up, Finch wants the girl, a rough voice shouted from the hallway. Garrett's hand went to his pistol, his body instantly shifting into that state of relaxed readiness. He motioned for Mai to move away from the door, to the far corner of the room. She clutched the ledger to her chest, her eyes wide, not with fear but with a fierce, protective resolve. Stay back, Garrett mouthed silently. The pounding came again, harder this time, splintering the wood around the lock. They weren't going to wait for an invitation. Finch had sent his hounds. The public challenge was being answered with private violence. Garrett drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing in the small room. He had come here to investigate a crime, but he had found a cause. The choice he thought he was offering me had vanished. The choice was now his. He could hand her over and continue his investigation quietly, or he could stand his ground and turn this entire town into a powder keg. The door crashed open. Two large, unshaven men filled the frame, their faces flushed with cheap liquor and malice. They stopped short when they saw Garrett, his pistol leveled steadily at the chest of the first man. "Evening, boys," Garrett said, his voice dangerously soft. "I think you have the wrong room. The lady is not receiving visitors." The first man, burly and confident, sneered. "Finch pays our wages, not you. He wants her. Give her to us, and you can walk away." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Garrett said. "Now, I suggest you go back and tell Mr. Finch his message was not received." The second man, slightly behind the first, began to reach for the pistol tucked into his belt. Garrett's eyes flickered to the movement. "I wouldn't," he warned. But the man was drunk and overconfident. His fingers closed around the grip of his gun. Garrett didn't hesitate. He didn't fire. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, he stepped forward and brought the heavy barrel of his own pistol down in a sharp, brutal arc onto the man's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone and a howl of pain. The man stumbled back, clutching his shattered hand. The first man, shocked by the sudden violence, froze for a half-second too long. Garrett used the opening, slamming the sole of his boot into the man's chest, sending him crashing back into the hallway. He followed through, grabbing the stunned man by the collar and shoving him into his injured partner. "Tell Finch," Garrett said, his voice a low growl, "that if he sends anyone else, I'll deliver his answer personally." He slammed the broken door shut and wedged the back of the room's only chair under the handle. He turned back to Mai. She was still pressed into the corner, but the ledger was no longer in her hands. It was tucked back into its secret compartment in her case, which she had latched shut. Her eyes were fixed on him, her expression a mixture of shock and a dawning, steely understanding. She had seen his capability, his utter lack of hesitation. "You are not just a drifter," she said softly. He holstered his pistol and pulled the badge from his inside pocket. The silver was dull, but the embossed letters were clear, U.S. Marshal. "No," he said. "I'm not." He looked at the shattered door, then at her. "And it seems we have a mutual interest in Mr. Alastair Finch." 6 months later, the wind that blew through Redemption Gulch was cooler, carrying the first hint of autumn. The sign above the small shop next to the telegraph office was new, the black lettering crisp against the painted wood, Mai's Imports and Finery. Inside, Mai stood behind a long wooden counter, discussing the quality of a bolt of silk with the wife of the town blacksmith. She wore a simple, well-made dress of blue cotton, her hair tied back practically. She moved with a quiet confidence that had become her signature. The people of Redemption Gulch, who had once stared at her as a curiosity, now greeted her with a nod of respect. She was a business owner, a taxpayer, and a provider of goods they couldn't get anywhere else. The case against Alastair Finch had been swift and decisive. With Mai's ledger as a guide and Garrett's federal authority to back him, they had secured a warrant and opened Finch safe. The original documents she sought were there, along with evidence of his land fraud in Wyoming. Finch was gone, taken by Garrett to stand trial before a federal judge. His assets were frozen, his power in the town broken overnight. Mai had used the reward money offered for his capture, which Garrett had insisted she take, to buy the lease on this shop and send for her family's remaining stock from San Francisco. A telegraph had arrived 2 weeks ago. Her father's business was saved. Garrett Shaw was still in town. He had been asked to stay on as the permanent town marshal, a position he accepted with some reluctance. He brought a quiet order to Redemption Gulch that it had never known. He didn't swagger or boast, he simply was. And his presence was enough. He walked past her shop now, his stride long and easy. He was on his evening patrol. He saw her through the front window, and their eyes met. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of acknowledgement. I paused in her conversation and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. It was all that passed between them. It was all that was needed. They were not lovers, not by a long shot. They were something rarer and perhaps stronger. They were partners, forged in a crucible of public humiliation and private courage. They had stood together against a powerful man and had, through their combined strengths, dismantled his empire of greed. As the blacksmith's wife left, Mai looked out at the street, at the setting sun casting long shadows from the storefronts. She thought of the purple silk dress, now carefully packed away in a trunk. It was a reminder of a promise her father had forced her to make. But the life she was living now was a promise she had made to herself. Here, in the dust and grit of the American West, she had found that a woman's honor was not something that could be bought or sold as part of a contract. It was something she had to build herself, one transaction, one conversation, one respectful nod at a time. And true respect, she now knew, was never given. It was earned. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.